Hey y'all, today let's do a Shimano Talica 16 2-speed. This one has a clicker issue, so you can hear it. Gotta fix that. I think one of the drawbacks of this reel, an amazing reel, but one of the drawbacks is in this area right here. Along the way, I want to show you kind of some of the things that I do to mitigate or to free up some of these spots that may be an issue. One I see here would be this rod clamp stud. Getting that out will be a little bit tricky, I think. So I'll show you that plus some other stuff. There's some tips inside here that I need to show you guys in terms of orientation of certain parts. So stay tuned. We're going to work on the gear side first, and then we'll work on the spool, and then lastly this clicker portion over here. So to get the reel opened up, I'm first going to remove that knob right here. I'm just going to pop this off. I'll show you that a little bit later on in the video. Now I got to remove, like I said, these 4 screws on the outside. Sometimes these can be an issue. So if that's the case, I don't think it is. These have a tendency to kind of get frozen up in there. Not necessarily frozen, but very tight and difficult to remove. All these screws are the same size, so nothing to worry about there. Just pull it up like that. So there are all the screws. Now I left the handle on because I wanted some leverage to unscrew this or to loosen this screw up here for the 2-speed portion of it. And as you can see by the arrow, to unscrew it, we're going to turn to the right or clockwise. Now we can go ahead and take that handle off by removing this cap. And when you're doing this, make sure that 2-speed button is in the up position, like so. Just pull straight up, nothing under there. Now to get this lever off, I like to hold my finger over the spring, lift that lever up over the little notch or tab that's on that black plastic piece there. Then you can just lift that up. And in case I forget, I'm going to tell you something now. When you line this back up or when you tighten the screw back down, there are 2 little holes or 2 little notches, indentations on the handle. You have to line that up, one of those points on the nut, to one of those to get this lined up properly, so this black piece can sit properly over it. It's counterclockwise to remove this handle or remove that nut there. I'm just going to unscrew it. Just pop straight up. You're going to have a cap, and there's a little washer under here somewhere. Let me push this gear back up so we can see it. Let me get it out for you. Right there. Then you also have a bushing and stuff that we're going to remove when we take this stuff out. Now to remove the gears, we're going to have to undo all these pieces here to access the for the removal of the gears. So we're going to remove the dog system by undoing these 2 screws here. You'll notice that these dogs, they only really go in one way, but you can also tell by there's a little indentation or a score on the bottom of that. That will be facing down. Take those off. And now we're just going to pull this straight up. With any luck, it'll just come up and nothing's frozen. But you want to be a little bit careful here because you don't want to bend any of those tines or wings on those dogs. Cool. Just going to lift that up like so. I'll take this off and I'll show you guys something. So this gear has a couple pieces in it, right? There's this piece that sits on top of it, so it looks kind of like that when you put it back together. when you're lining this back up to put it back together, these squares have to be lined up just like that. They can't be off-centered or off-kilter or anything, because they have to go back inside the spool in a little square. These posts also come out. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, because they might be frozen or something in there. Now we can remove this gear. That's the pinion bearing that fell out there, and we also have that bushing on top. And that's it for that. So let's go ahead and, well, I'm sorry, there's one more piece here. That piece actually does come up. Show it to you just in case you need to see it. There's a little tab on the bottom of it that fits inside the receiving hole on the housing there. All right, so for the gear, you have one bearing, and then you have this metal piece. I'm gonna clean it off before I take it up or pick it up, because I want to show you what it looks like. Let's get that off. Now this metal piece, the way it's gonna sit is, there's a raised point on this. That raised point is gonna be facing up, and that flat end, or the flat side, will be facing down. The raised portion of this will be in the center ring, not on the outside ring. The outside ring is also kind of recessed there, but that will be facing down towards the gears. That's one point I wanted to show you guys. To take this apart, you're simply going to undo this screw here, and then I'll show you how those gears sit. When you're unscrewing this, just be a little bit careful. There's a spring under there. You can pull that bushing off, the plastic piece right there. This comes out. Now you can pull that that pin right there out, and then the last piece inside here is another spring that goes above it. So for the gears, when you're taking this off, now for this piece, there's actually, I don't think it makes much of a difference if you put it this way or this way, but if you want to go based on how the reel was set up, there's some little tabs or notches on the bottom here. There's 3 of them. Those notches are facing down to the low gear, and the smooth part, or no notches on the top, are facing up towards the high gear. On these 2 gears, you'll notice that there's 2 raised ends. If you look on the inside there, 2 recessed ends. Those recessed ends will be facing each other, kind of like so, with that piece in the middle of it. Alright, so I'm gonna get this cleaned up. There was not a lot of issues here to kind of go over with you guys. One thing I do want to note here is that these things will get a lot of water kind of seeping around it, so I'm going to take those off and just kind of clean up the area as well. Just add a little bit of protection to it is all I'm trying to do. Yeah, that's it. Alright, so I'll get this cleaned up. I'm going to be using this, which is a toothbrush, some corrosion X if I need to break down some sort of a grease or whatever that's kind of caked on there, which I don't think there is. And that's probably about all I'm going to be using for this. Oh, one last point. Let me show you the lever. The lever, you have a few pieces on here. You have the cam follower here. See those little dots on the inside of it? That's for the clicker. That's on this button, and you'll see inside there's a little click pin that has a pin and a spring underneath it. I'll probably take that out also and clean that up. And then you also have a black piece. Where'd I put that? These 2 pieces that go inside. There's this washer that goes on top like so, and then that plastic spacer right there goes above it like that. Alright, I'll see you guys in a bit after I clean this up. Okay, so a couple of things I didn't show you on the breakdown. There's also a clicker assembly inside this lever. Same sort of concept as inside the tension knob. You have a pin, and then you have a spring inside. I'm gonna kind of just leave that alone. That just makes a noise when you move the lever back and forth off of this little ridge thing here. Second thing was this piece was also inside the drive shaft. So that was the last piece to come out that I did not mention. Alright, so first thing I'm going to do is work on the gears, but I'm going to grease these bearings first. And I prefer to grease them over oiling them because they're come in contact with a lot of salt water. So that's why I do that. Initially when you grease these things and then use the reel, there may be some sort of slowdown in the feel of the reel when you're cranking it or whatever. That's because a little bit of a buildup of or excess grease in there, but that kind of works its way out over time. So it's not a permanent thing. Alright, so actually before I get to the gears, let me show you the handle because I want to make sure the handle is fine before I put that back on. And I'm just going to check the handle knob, essentially is what I'm looking at. So to open that up, I'm going to just stick a pin. I have a jig head that I modified that I use sometimes. I like to use a pick. It's a little bit stronger. Pop that straight up. And I'm just going to undo this screw inside here just to lift up the assembly and see how, not the top part, I'm more concerned about the bottom part, how that looks. And that bushing looks okay. There's a little washer under there. We're going to leave all that stuff on there. We're just going to clean this off and re-grease it, essentially is all we're doing. Alright, so let's add a little bit of grease to this. So around the bottom there, some on the shaft, and a little bit inside that hole right there. That should be good. I'm just going to stick that back on. Now when you're sticking this back on, be a little bit careful because you don't want to push that stack up. And if you do, you just have to reset it. Now while that's like that, before I screw it down, I'm going to add some oil to the top where there's a bearing sitting there. That also adds a layer of protection to the stack as well. And I much prefer that bushing on the bottom, that plastic bushing on the bottom, versus a bearing, because that's the one that has a tendency to kind of go bad on you. Just kind of working that oil inside there. We're just going to stick this back inside. While I'm here, I'm going to grease this a little bit. Certain points, I do the bottom part where it interacts with that cap right there. Inside the hole. Top part as well. And definitely where those screws go into the handle. Or into the blank. Kind of like that. Alright, so let's go ahead and grease inside here, and I'm going to stick that pinion bearing inside. That's just so I don't forget it and get too far ahead and have to take everything apart to do it again. I'm going to grease here where that bottom bearing, or the bearing that goes on top of this drive shaft, sits. A little bit on top where that bushing sits up there. And I'm going to grease those holes as well where those dogs will sit. Now you need to put a light amount of grease in here because if you put too much, it'll be difficult to seat those posts properly. Somewhere the screws are going to go in. And let's go ahead and show you how to seat these things. There's a point on one end. That point will be facing up. Now when I put this inside, it's going to create a vacuum. So you're going to have to push a couple times. Just like that. You want to push a couple times to get that air kind of escaping and make sure it's sitting flush inside there. Let me show you again. Good. Now we can grease some of the gears, the main gears, and then we'll work on the rest of it. Light amount of grease is all you need on these things. You don't need a lot. But I'm also going to grease the entire surface area of this of these gears because I see some wear on there. Light amount of grease here as well. I did clean that inside off with a wire brush just to get any of that contaminants or buildup off of it. Now we're going to grease inside here, just kind of where that pin goes through. Same deal for the low speed gear. And then we're going to grease this shaft, and then we're going to kind of work this assembly back together, and then I think we're going to set it aside and work on some other stuff. I'm greasing the threads inside here where that nut goes inside. And at top as well where the other nut goes, or the other screw goes. Alright, so let's set this back up. I forgot a couple pieces already. Hold on. I'm going to add a light amount of grease to these springs here. That should be good. And what am I missing in terms of greasing? Let's do this now, so we don't have to stop along the way to do this. Add some grease inside there. A little bit of grease on this plate, or this washer right here. Alright, so where's our shaft? First thing we're going to do is take this piece. I want to rest it here like this. Take the smaller of the two springs, stick it inside, and you want to push that in to where it's lined up. The opening on that pin right there is lined up with the opening on the shaft, just like so. And you're going to test this after you put it together anyhow. So this pin goes in just like this, looking just like that. Stick it across, get it kind of centered. Then you can take your other spring and stick that on like that, just like so. Now we're going to take this washer. You do not need to grease these things. I think it's just a force of habit to start greasing stuff, so I grease, even if it's a light amount. That's going to sit over here like this. Those two tabs are going to fit in the notch on the shaft. And then we're going to screw it in. You're going to have to push down as you screw, and remember you're going backwards to tighten it, like so. I'm just going to hand tighten this for now. Then we'll tighten it all up or snug it down when we get everything put together, or put the handle on and everything else. Remember, the indented side is facing up. The recessed side is facing up. The indented side, or the side that's pushing out, is facing down. That's going to fit over it like this. Take our little spacer here. Remember those little notched end or notch pieces, that end is facing down. As you can see, all of this is going over that pin. And for the main gear, the recessed side is facing down. That tabbed or bumped up end is facing up. Like so. Now we'll take our washer, and like I said before, that inner raised end is facing up towards the handle, so it sits just like that. Then you have your bearing that will go on top of that, like so. When you get here, make sure it's all the way down. Has to fit over that shaft properly. Alright, so now we can set that aside, and I'm going to work on putting the dog and the pinion gear together. Get this greased up, and I think if you're watching any of my videos before on conventional reels, I do enjoy adding a generous amount of grease to pinion gears, and this will be no different. I'm sure there's a reason why I did it, or why I do it. I couldn't tell you what it is. Alright, so this squared end, or this smooth end, is going to be going over it just like so. Now you don't need to line this up right now. Remember that squared, there's a squared end on this piece and a squared end up here. They need to be aligned, but you don't need to do it right now. That little piece is going to go inside the pinion gear. Next we're going to take our ratchet. I'm just adding some residual grease from my fingers onto the plate, and I'm going to add a light amount to the entire surface area of this dog, or these dogs, including inside the leaves. That was a bit much right there, I think. That should be good. Alright, so to line these up, we're going to there's a kind of a not flush end or flat end, and one flat end. That not flush end kind of faces down, the flat end faces up. Set one up about right there, and the other one goes probably right here. That might be too far over. Let's line it up and find out. Yeah, that looks, I think it looks good. Where we at? Oh, no, it does not look good. I'm just gonna line it up and see. Now we're too far off on one, so they're a little closer together, I think. Yeah, okay. That's how it's gonna look, like that. Alright, so let me backtrack a second here. I can't put the dog on yet, and I apologize for that. I'm going to stick the main gear in with the handle, secure everything there, so I'll show you the top part, and then we'll do the dog afterwards, because that has to go in after the main gear goes in, so I apologize. Alright, so we're going to stick the main gear straight through just like that. Make sure the bearing gets inside the housing there. That feels like it is. And you could do this before or after, but I'm going to stick this bushing on afterwards. Just like so. Next we're going to put our washer on there, our cap, and let's stick this handle on. Now the first thing we're going to put on is the push pin. Add a little bit of grease right around there. You can put some here also if you want. And I'm also going to add some to the thread. Now we can screw that in. Now I'm going to put this entire assembly together, so I'm going to tighten this down to where it's the finished product. And I'm going to use that side right there. That should be good. I don't want it too snug in there. Alright, that should be good. Yeah, we're looking good there. Leave that on. Don't need to do much to that. For this cover, I'm going to add a light amount of grease inside, just all over the place. I'm going to grease the button itself. Definitely add a little bit of grease to this to the spring here. Let's stick that on, just like so. Now we're going to line this up. the way to put this back in is to just put it in from this end. Keep that back on there. Get back on there. Put it in from this end. Like that. And I'm going to hold over this as I push that lever over the post on that plastic piece. And that's it. Lever's going to cover it up. You can let it go. It doesn't really do anything. But just in case, you can certainly keep your finger over it as well. And screw that back in place. Snug is fine. You don't need to over tighten that. Now I can hold onto this handle and tighten this nut up. Check and make sure it feels alright. I'll check my gears. Bottom one. Good. So that works. Alright, so now let's do this. I'm going to stick our pinion gear in. You want to make sure it lines up properly. So both gears need to line up and it needs to sit flush to where that upper gear is just raised just above that low speed gear. I'm going to take my dog and get this over kind of keyed up on there. Like so. I don't want to sit in too low because I need to be able to get this over the post. Keep the post or the dogs inside those little blockades or barricades or barriers right there. And then we're just going to cover it up and screw it in. Alright, so while we're here, so we don't forget, just checking to make sure how it feels. Feels okay. So before we forget, or so we don't forget, I'm going to line that up right there with a little bit of grease, then stick that plastic clicker over. Keep that in place. And I'm also going to do these stoppers. By adding a little bit of grease inside the holes. And screwing them back in. Snug on these is good as well. You don't need to over tighten them. Okay, let's do the spool. Just going to pull it out. Pretty straightforward. And we're going to remove this portion first so we can pull it out. Undo those 4 screws right there. Now when you're undoing these screws, you want to have some downward pressure onto this when you're undoing those screws, because the heads on them can be stripped and no one likes that. So pull the stack straight out like that. And now we can undo this cover. That's for the drag plate by undoing these 4 screws here. Now sometimes when you're removing this, it can be a little tight. Let me pop these screws off because there's a seal inside here, so just be aware of that. Then you have that spring, you have a bearing inside there, we're going to pull out in a sec. And to get the drag plate off, or the drag washer off, excuse me, you're going to do those 4 screws. Drag washer just kind of falls out, and we can pop this bearing out of there. Save the drag washer. Just get those screws out. I'm not going to remove this here, but to get that plate off, you can undo those 4 screws. I'm just going to remove the bearing. Sometimes these bearings are different. Size is really all that matters in these bearings, but sometimes you'll have a different style of bearing on the inside with the spool versus inside here. That's it for that. Let's remove that pin to get this click plate off, or click gear off. And now to remove this tension washer stack, we're going to undo an E-clip that's here. I'm just going to stick a screwdriver in one of the gaps and just kind of rotate or twist to pull it off. Then you're gonna have 4 washers and a thrust washer underneath there that goes on top of the bearing right here. I lost it. All right, so for the drag plate, you can use something like brake cleaner fluid to clean it off. If it looks good, you don't have to do anything to it at all. There's already a little bit of grease on there, so you could leave it as is if it looks really good. I'm going to clean this up a little bit and then add new grease to it. So same kind of process. I clean everything up, use paper towels, Q-tips, my toothbrush and all that stuff. Get all the stuff cleaned up, come back to you in a sec. Okay, so for the O-ring that's around here, the gasket, I don't remove it unless it needs to be replaced. Taking it off is, but putting it back on is not that easy. So I just kind of leave it alone. All right, so I'm gonna grease the drag washer. First, I'm gonna add some grease inside here where it's gonna sit. Take a Q-tip, get inside that hole right there. And I'm using Cal's drag grease for this. I like to use the same kind of grease on the same side. Get some grease on those holes where the screw is going to go. Get inside there. And I don't want too much on there, I just kind of want a light coat. Same for the back of the drag washer. Just to get a light coat on there. And now I'm going to grease it with a light amount of drag grease. And here's the name of it if you don't understand my speaking, because I know I don't speak the best sometimes. So for the bearings, I'm going to oil these instead of adding grease. Alright, so let's start by putting the drag washer back in. Let's get the bearing inside, one of these bearings inside there. Just going to line that up and screw it in. Lightly snug is good. You don't want to go too hard on this. And now we can work on the other side with the shaft. Let me add some grease to around here. Some over that hole where that pin is going to go in. And you can lightly grease the shaft if you want to. When we get to this point, but I'm probably going to grease this the threads on that end right there. Alright, now I am going to lightly grease all these washers. Stick our bearing on. This bearing washer here. And the way these clutch washers are going to sit is they're going to be facing each other, so like a concave or convex sort of thing. Looks almost like a flying saucer. These are it's pretty difficult to see this one, but you can kind of get the feel for it when you're putting it together yourself. Then we're just going to resecure this E-clip. And make sure it's all the way down. I get started with that pliers and then I push it on with the screwdriver. Now we can certainly go ahead and stick that back into the hole. Let me go ahead and grease inside here where the bearing is going to sit. And also grease those holes where those screws are going to go. Stick that in just like that. If the bearing fell out, I'm going to just drop it back inside. And you can push that down with this spring. I don't need to do that yet, but just give me a little tip there. Now we can stick the cap back on and screw that or secure it. If you're getting lost with these screws, where'd my hose go? If you're getting lost with these screws, the screws that will be going on here would be the ones that have a slanted head or a sloped head. The ones with the flathead went over the drag washers, and the thin flathead ones go in this cap. I want to snug these down, but as with anything, you don't want to over tighten them. Let's add a little bit of grease to this pin. And let's just go ahead and not stick that in yet, because I want to put the cap on. Stick this other bearing on. When you're putting this bearing on, make sure it goes correctly over the shaft, because there's a little ridge there that has to get over, just over, to fit properly. Grease inside where that top bearing is going to sit. Now we're going to stick this over it. Make sure it fits in there and spins just like that. And let's go ahead and add some grease to these holes as well. I should have done that before. I'm just going to wipe off the excess with my fingers. Also adds a light coat around the edge. Alright, so just position it over and screw it in. Now, you're going to have a difficult time kind of pushing that down, so don't even try. You want to get it close enough to where you can screw those these 4 screws in. So I'm just going to stick one in the hole and kind of find the first one. We're way off. Just to get it started, and I'm going to go across from it to do the other one. And I'm not going to go all the way down on this yet, but I am going to go pretty close. That's because if you go snug right away, you might have a difficult time getting the other 2 screws in. Because essentially what you're doing here is you're compressing that gasket down inside the chamber there. And that looks good. Alright, so now we can stick our pin inside there. And I kind of just wipe some of the grease off and put it onto the other side. Or you can just do it this way. Alright, let's go ahead and get the rod clamp assembly off. And this is one of the areas where it might be a little bit of an issue. And it's always good to do what I'm doing here if you've never done it. I'm going to unscrew these. If this is tough to remove, well, first let me go ahead and remove this plate so it doesn't get in my way. But if it's tough to remove those studs there, I'm going to show you what I would do normally. And I already believe I'm going to have an issue with it, but you never know. It might look bad, but not be bad. So it's counterclockwise to remove these screws. I'm going to start lightly. Yeah, it's moving, but I'm always concerned about sharing these things off, so show you in a sec. Yeah, okay. So what I would do here normally, or what I'm going to do, is I'm going to spray these things down with some corrosion ash. Just like so. And then, this doesn't work on every kind of situation, depending on the screw and receiving plate or frame or whatever materials. But it will on this one because they are different. I'm just going to heat it up quite a bit too. So it'll take a little bit of a process, and I'm going to go back and forth with heat, some corrosion X, heat again. And it does get hot. Of course, when you're doing this, you want to make sure that there's no plastic pieces around that can get damaged. It's hot. Good, I heard a bit of crackling, that's always good. Now this is where I have to use something to hold it with. And we just kind of work at this, right? This is kind of one of those things where it might take several times to go back and forth doing that to get it removed. But in my opinion, this is one of those critical things for the longevity of your reel, especially this reel, well, similar to this. And I'm gonna work that in. I'll tell you a little trick that I do, because I'm always cognizant or aware or just on the lookout for any shearing off or snapping off screws. Trust me, I have done it before, even though I've done this trick before. So it doesn't mean that you still can't snap it even if you're careful. In any event, what I do here is I kind of work that screw out, and then to make sure I'm not snapping it off, I will retighten this. And if it tightens and I feel that tighten on me, then I know I'm doing okay so far. To get this out, I would do this anyhow, because all I'm doing is working the threads on the screw up and helping that corrosion X work down into the thread at the same time. So I'm going to go back and forth on this. You kind of saw what I'm doing in terms of the process, and I'll come back to you when it's removed. Alright, so we got these out of there, and I've cleaned all the stuff off already. I'm just going to spray some corrosion X inside these threads. Here as well. Then I'm going to add some grease to it. I'm just going to put it back in. But the reason it's critical is because if you ever get to the point where these things need to be replaced or whatever, and you've never done this to the studs, then you're going to have a difficult time. I may end up having to buy an entire new frame, and that's not good. There's a couple of, I think, weak points in this reel, and I'm going to kind of show you some of these as we go. This was definitely one of them, but this is the same thing for a lot of reels. Just snug it down. You don't need to over tighten this one either. And now I'm going to add some oil to the threads right there. Now I'm going to screw these on before I put on the clamp, just to get that oil working inside the threads in there as well. Now we can stick that back on. Alright, so the clicker, it looks like everything is missing in here. I thought we might find some washers, maybe an E-clip inside here, but we have nothing. So all I'm doing is I'm going to take this off by removing the one end of each spring from the post. And you kind of want to know the orientation of how it sits. It's sitting with that raised end facing up that way, so looking like that. Alright, so I'm going to clean this stuff up. talk about this first in a sec, or when I come back, and show you this plate here, how that goes back on. Okay, so if you look right there, you see a little bit of wear that's happening around that edge right there. Can't really see it on this side, but on the inside you can definitely see it. There's a plastic bushing or something that the click button rides on. So when you stick it in, I forgot the name of it. It's like a little clicker plate, right? So it goes up like that, but it stops it. So the issue is not that part. I mean, that part kind of wears out too, and you have to replace it. But the concern I have for this reel is there's a tendency for water to collect around that edge right there and eat away at the spacing. So if that gap gets, or if it gets eaten away so much that that gap gets too big, then that bushing or sleeve inside there loses effectiveness, and you have to replace this entire thing anyhow. And the other thing I noticed was that these click buttons have a tendency to kind of wear down in the channel where the E-clip goes. So I got a new one just in case, but I'm going to test this one out by putting the E-clip on it and see how it feels. If it goes on too easy, which it just did, I'm not using it, because that vibration is going to essentially get that loosened up again, and it's going to fall off like it did the first time. So those are two things that I think I see on this reel that I don't really care for, or I think maybe they need to redesign it or be a little bit better. I don't know if they made a newer version or not, or if they addressed that, but that's an issue I see with the reel. Really nice reel overall, but there's a couple things like this that could be a little bit better. Alright, so let's show you how to put this click assembly back. I'm going to add grease to a couple points, one being inside there where that shaft is going to sit. You don't have to take, I mean, you could take these out also and do the same thing, those posts for the springs, same thing I did for these. To me, that's not as critical as doing the studs for the rod clamp. A little bit of grease just on top of the plate, but not a whole lot you can really do there, like so. I'm also going to add a little bit of grease to this click button, and I'm going to add a little bit of grease where that E-clip is going to sit. And I think that's all we're going to do for that, and yep, that's all we're going to do. Alright, so the first piece that goes on is this little clear plastic washer. And these are all things that we're missing from the reel. And I'm just going to stick it on inside like that. I'm going to stick it down to the lower portion, or as far down this way as it can go, because I need the room to access it. One metal washer. They have them listed differently on the schematic. I'm not sure if there are different sizes or not, but just so you know. And for the click tongue, I'm going to stick on the springs before I install this, and you're going to start from the top and work down for these springs, so it looks like that. Now I'm just going to stick that over the post. This is where you need tweezers. And I'm not going to put those springs on yet. I'm going to just complete the assembly for this post here. Stick on a second metal washer. I'm going to try to get as far down as I can. Then I'm going to use my finger from the back side to keep it up as I put this E-clip on. Rest the E-clip like that. That looks pretty good actually. I don't need to do anything else, I don't think. And now I'm just going to clip it on. Let me use my trusty E-clip here. And you want to make sure that's fully seated, which this one is. Now we can take our pin or our pick and kind of put that over each shaft so that we can complete the assembly. When you put it over, we want to make sure that's seated all the way down so it has no chance of flying up on you. You just want to make sure it's under the ridge of that screw there. Just making sure that end of the spring is in before I start this side. I know I'm kind of blocking you there. Try to do it this way so you can see it, but you kind of get the idea, I think. And that's set. I want to make sure we're not having any issues with it. Now I'm going to pop this back out because I don't want that impeding when I'm putting the wheel back together. Alright, so the final few steps are going to be just adding some grease to these holes. Kind of wiping that around so it kind of gets all the surface there. And for this plate, the way it's going to sit is exactly like this. This is exactly how it's going to look. That hole or notch is going to be closer to the rod clamp. Okay, so now let's go ahead and put the reel together. Before I even start putting everything together, I want to make sure that both dogs are engaging properly. Sometimes one gets stuck somewhere and then only one is functioning, so you want to make sure both are working, which this one is. This is the moment where it's critical for me to line those squares up. So I'm just turning the handle to line both squares up, because I'm going to fit that square over it, and it needs to sit flush. And you can definitely feel it, but you can also see when it's flush. If it's not flush, it's going to be riding slightly high, and you'll be able to notice it. If you don't notice it there, you'll definitely notice it when you try to put the reel together. There will be too far of a gap between this right side and the housing. So this one's in there properly already. So now I'm just going to drop this in, and to get that seat on this side, I'm just going to find that hole, stick it in there, and if it didn't sit right away, I would just rotate this handle to get that to drop into place. Now this is the gap I'm referring to. If this was not seated properly, that pin or that end of the shaft would be real low compared to that, and this gap would be somewhere in this neighborhood. I don't want to take it out because I don't want to mess up the I don't want to mess up the orientation of the pinion gear. So let's go ahead and grease these threads on the housing screws. Then we'll just finish this up. And these are the only screws on the reel that I do kind of try to get pretty snug on there. Make sure it's lined up properly like that, and let's just screw it in. Just getting one down to secure it. I'm not going all the way down yet, but pretty close. Now I just snug these down with maybe about a tenth or a quarter of a turn. Nothing crazy. But after I get them snug, I do that extra little step there. Not even a quarter of a turn. I can just add a light amount of grease around here. Don't really need it. But you know, if water can collect under it, then water can kind of eat away at the metal. Stick this over it. That sits over that little metal piece right there. And now we can do a little bit of greasing on certain points. Light grease on the top part where that clicker is, and a little bit of grease around here on the bottom side. A little bit of grease on these two little pins right there. That's kind of where that cam follower rides on, and around there. And you kind of do the same thing for the back side. Just be careful you don't knock that pin out of there. This pin I'm referring to right there. Now we can just set this up. I'm going to drop it over and just kind of rotate it down to that bottom part. You may need to move it up slightly to get this to sit on there properly. Those two little notches will fit over those two posts that's on the lever, and when it's seated, that entire assembly will be flush. If it's not flush, then it's not right. You need to do it again. Then we're just going to screw it on. Let's make sure it works. Feels good. That works. Low gear works. I can feel the dog. Let's try the clicker to make sure it works now. And now we have a fully functioning clicker again. That's good. Alright guys, thanks for watching. I hope to help some of you guys out there. If it did, please hit that thumbs up button and consider subscribing to the channel, and as well as spreading the word about it as well. Alright guys, thanks again, and I'll see you all next time. Now I'm going to take our... let's see if I can do this or not. I think I can, brother. I think I can, brother. I think I can. I think I can. Get up. Stand up. For your right. Too close. Get up, stand up. For your right. Right there. Where are we at? Oh my goodness, I got lost.